50 Forgotten Books is a slightly awkward title, especially somewhere like here, where forgotten is one of those words that means different things to different people. Some of the books here were never actually well enough known to be remembered or forgotten. Others will be familiar to you. We sent an advance copy to Michael Derder, the Pulitzer Prize winning critic in the Washington Post, who wrote back and said, "Thank you very much. There's 2 or 3 titles amongst the 50 I've never heard of." Great. Whereas my mum didn't quite say that she thought I'd made them all up, but I'm assuming that everyone's kind of on a spectrum somewhere between the two. It's a hybrid book in that it does have 50 books which I recommend that people ought to read, that I thoroughly enjoyed. But the memoir is partly to put into context why I'm recommending the various books. For all of us, most of the time, the text is paramount. I do admit that I have 2 or 3 books in my own collection which I'm never going to read because they're the wrong language. I don't understand the language, but I still revere the books. But it is the text. However, the edition that you buy a book in is important. We've all bought books and then sort of upgraded to a later edition or a first edition, one signed by the author. It's not just the book, it's where you read it and who you're with when you read it. For me, I'm always remembering where I bought a book, and again, who I was with, who sold me the book, whether it was George Locke just over the road, or various other book dealers I've come across, or people who've made recommendations. I think one of the people who's made most recommendations of books to me, Ros may come second, but Mark Valentine here has probably recommended even more. And that's really important to me, so that books on my shelves are kind of like a diary or aid memoir. I remember where I was when I got various books, what I was doing, who I was with. One of the books that's been most important to me over the years, and I will mention this partly because it is Arthur Machen's birthday, but because it's probably the most extreme example of a book that's affected me and continues to affect me, is Arthur Machen's The Hill of Dreams. When I was about 15, I was reading what I thought of as existentialist literature. I was a very pretentious teenager, and what I was actually doing was reading mainly European Penguin modern classics. And I was obviously boring the hell out of Noel Brooks, a book dealer in Brighton on Queen's Road, an amazing bookshop. Every shelf was at least 4 deep with books, and he would always know exactly where a book was. He would say, "Oh, 3rd floor, left of the window, 2nd shelf down, 2 back." And as I say, I was going in and talking to him about existentialist literature, and one day he gave me the Corgi paperback of The Hill of Dreams, with the Lord Dunsany introduction. And I took it away and I read it as an existentialist text. As far as I was concerned, it was a book about a young man who had an artistic vision which he failed to communicate to anyone. And that's all the book was about. And then in later years I read it when I first moved to Sheffield, to a city for the first time. I lived in the countryside, and really enjoyed the countryside writing and wanted it. I was feeling homesick, and then when I moved back to Sussex I enjoyed the city stuff more. Even recently Adrian Eckersley has written a great article in Faunus on The Hill of Dreams, which completely changed my appreciation of it again. And if anything, bizarrely, we're on the 4th printing of this book, amazingly. What seems to have struck a chord is other people feel the same way. They all have stories about their favourite books and why it's important to them. So what I would probably best if I read you something from a section on Arthur Machen's The Tales of Horror and the Supernatural. Yeah. In September 1987, I was in Providence, Rhode Island, with a fellow architecture student, Alex Wall. We were travelling around the USA on Greyhound buses, looking at famous buildings and buying more books than we could carry. We had come to Providence because I wanted to explore College Hill, where H.P. Lovecraft lived for most of his life and had set many of his stories. However, the Lovecraftian spell was beginning to wane. I ought to explain, perhaps, right, I'll break it into my reading. The discovery of the Hill of Dreams led me to Machen, which led me to the old the old Arthur Machen Society, which has now become the Friends of Arthur Machen. It's led us to publish, Rosalie and I, at Tartarus Press, and we publish, initially it was Arthur Machen, but various other writers. But I think I would have ended up with coming to Machen another route, which I don't really mention in here, because when I was trying to, I think going back as far as I possibly can, I listened to Toyah's album, Sheep Farming in Barnet. Now, it's not the coolest album to have listened to, but on the back were cut up quatrains from Nostradamus's, what's the word? His prophecies. And I went out and I bought Erica Cheatham's edition of Nostradamus in paperback, and in the back there was an advert for the Necronomicon by George Hay, who came from Hastings. And because Toyah sang about the Necronomicon in IER, I bought the Necronomicon. I came across Lovecraft. I was then reading Lovecraft, Machen, Blackwood and all those authors. I would have ended up with Machen, I'm sure. However, it's a bit like a Ronnie Corbett thing. I'm going to carry on here. Right. Back to Providence, Rhode Island. It was our plan to stay at a hostel the night we arrived, but the Grateful Dead were in town for several days, and all available accommodation was booked by deadheads. While deciding what to do, we walked down the drive of the Halsey Mansion on College Hill, the fictional home of Lovecraft's Charles Dexter Ward, and started talking to the housekeeper, a homesick Welshwoman, who kindly offered us a guided tour of the building. I remember that it had a ballroom, and there was a story about a reappearing bloodstain, but the most notable part of the tour was the cellar, which had a door to underground passages, which was said to go down to the river. We only went part way into them because the woman was petrified that they would cave in. They were really not in a good way. I don't think we could have actually penetrated any further anyway, but I was subsequently told by various people that the tunnels that Lovecraft talks about, the slave tunnels in Charles Dexter Ward, are superstition and folklore. They're not. I've been in them. We were very grateful when the housekeeper invited us to stay for several nights. The following day I spent a few hours looking through the Lovecraft manuscripts at Brown University Library, while Alex took a trip to Newport. When we met up again late that afternoon, we went into a slightly utilitarian Providence bookstore that I remember as being full of metal racking. I was, though, very pleased to find the not hardback edition of Machen's Tales of Horror and the Supernatural, which I would replace my 2 paperback volumes of the same name. I also bought a Lancer paperback of Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror. It still seems terribly ungrateful of me, but in the Charles Dexter Ward mansion that evening, after dinner, for the first time I thought to compare the prose style of the 2 writers, and I found Lovecraft seriously deficient. Machen's prose was sonorous and highly suggestive. A quote here. Dyson heard the noise of the brook singing far below, the song of clear and shining water, rippling over the stones, whispering and murmuring as it sank to dark, deep pools. Across the stream, just below the house, rose a grey stone bridge, vaulted and buttressed, a fragment of the Middle Ages, and then beyond the bridge, the hills rose again, vast and rounded like bastions, covered here and there with dark woods and thickets of undergrowth. But the heights were all bare of trees, showing only grey turf and patches of bracken, touched here and there with the gold of fading fronds. Dyson looked to the north and south, and still he saw the wall of the hills, and the ancient woods, and the stream drawn in and out between them, all grey and dim, with morning mist beneath a grey sky, in a hushed and haunted air. Beside this, Lovecraft's prose seemed strained and overwritten. In the very bosom of Lovecraft country, all I wanted to do was to get back home and reread The Hill of Dreams. Now, I'm going to have to admit that I spent a lot of time when I was first, well, even today, in bookshops, most of which are the antithesis of Watkins. Most bookshops that I've gone in over the years, if you ask for the horror section and they admit to having one, it's usually with the science fiction, and it's usually in the furthest room on the lowest shelves in the darkest part of the shop. And then that shades into alternative thinking and alternative religions and the occult. And because a lot of bookshops don't really want to admit they have those shelves, they don't really look after them properly, and fact and fiction mix and mingle. And I've always said that I don't believe in the occult. I'm not allowed to say that here in the but I think the occult has inspired some of the best fiction ever. I have bought Crowley's magical books and I've passed them on, but I've kept Moonchild and The Diary of a Drug Fiend. There are various authors like that who, I'm trying to think, the reason Ros and I and Mark Valentine have written, we've got a copy of Literary Hauntings there, yeah. People like Peter Haining did Gazetteers, where you could go to Herstmonceux Castle and he would say that a drummer boy has been known to be seen on the battlements every now and again, or in one particular room sometimes there's a grey lady, and you read it and you think, did I come all the way here not to see or hear anything particularly inspiring? Because real life ghosts are really dull. They're just usually repeating something that was meant to have happened to them in their lives. But literary ghost stories, what you really want to do is visit all the spots that have inspired. I mean, we've worked out now where the empty house is from Algernon Blackwood is in Hove in Brighton. I think we've got about 270 or 280 locations you can visit, and they're just as creepy, even though I'm not saying that ghosts are real or not. I have my own ghost story, even though I don't believe in them. I have heard a ghost. But the literary ghost stories, brilliant. A great deal of time for mediums and the Spiritualist Church, not least because my cousin communicated with the dead on a regular basis a few years ago, until she got a proper job, and it didn't make as much money. And I know her and I love her, but I'm going to read from the chapter here about The Child Cephalina by Rebecca Lloyd, and it'll all make sense in a second. As a teenager, I discovered a great deal of interest in the Directory of Possibilities, edited by Colin Wilson and John Grant, an encyclopedia of fringe thinking, as it was described, from the Bermuda Triangle to black holes. No concept was too wacky, and as I recall, the most sceptical aspect of the book was the title. They're just possibilities. One of the first entries that interested me at the time was Spiritualism, because I had heard somebody discussing a local spiritualist church with a great deal of respect, despite the fact that I had been told that seances and the Ouija board were associated with the occult. I failed to see the difference. All were attempting to communicate with the dead, and none sounded too believable. I was surprised to read that even the slightly credulous, shall we say, Colin Wilson, condemned the simplistic spiritualism associated with the church, although he blithely attributed most observable spiritualist phenomena to poltergeist activity. Anyway, the book fueled my interest in occult phenomena, although I never came close to believing in any of it. To my way of thinking, magic in the occult required the same kind of faith that was required by organised religions. Over the years, I've never read any non-fiction written from the point of view of a believer in either God or the devil that was half as compelling, insightful and well written as fiction that explored the same ideas. It was therefore with great interest that I watched online as the author Rebecca Lloyd documented her research into the early days of spiritualism, wondering what she might make of it in her fiction. The result, The Child Cephalina, set in London in 1851, is a brilliant book, written with understanding, compassion and insight. It's also very unsettling. Lloyd's narrator, Robert Groves, is researching and writing a book on the lives of street children, many of whom he invites into his house at 12 Judd Street, where they are fed and interviewed. His intentions are entirely laudable, and his practical philanthropy is overseen by his down-to-earth housekeeper, Tetty Brandling. But everything is upset when the enigmatic and unfathomable 11-year-old child Cephalina appears. She is not quite like the other children. For a start, she is too well cared for. Tetty is certain that there is something wrong with the girl, but Groves is fascinated by her and discovers that she is being used in fake seances by a very dubious couple called the Clutchers. Groves hatches a plan to adopt her, although this is confused by her insistence that she has a twin sister, Euphoria, who may or may not be real. The cast of characters employed by Lloyd to tell her story are not only believable but nuanced, from the well-meaning but naive Groves to the loyal but harassed Tetty and the odd job boy, Martin Ebast. And then there is Cephalina herself, a child, and therefore an innocent, whatever has happened to her, yet at the same time harbouring secrets and not necessarily being honest with Groves. In less assured hands there would have been a very uncomfortable vein in his interest in the young girl, but Groves' naivety is convincing and his compassion believable. As Lloyd takes us through this compelling story, one is concerned for all the characters. The background of spiritualism is fascinating, especially the relationship between those who are desperate to believe and those who fraudulently exploit them. The seance described by Lloyd is particularly impressive, and the doubts that Lloyd creates are wonderfully in sympathy with those that the most materialist observers would have felt at the time. It's a wonderful book, and again, it's an example of, I do think spiritualism is a version of the occult. It's not mainstream thinking, it's more mainstream, I suppose. And she does it, Rebecca Lloyd writes about it extremely well. As I say, I don't believe in ghosts. I have my own ghost story. There was this family farm. We heard something strange, which I can't say is a ghost, but I have no way of explaining who was playing the piano when there was nobody in the room. And I don't believe in fate, even though I was always going to end up with Arthur Machen. When I first wrote this book, when it was first published, there's a point in here where I talk about Arthur Machen's The Hill of Dreams, published in a blue paper edition, and just about the day this was published, I found a copy, after all these years of looking, that I could afford. It was amazing. We did a reading at Mag's Brothers end of last year, and I decided to read about Roland Topor's The Tenant, which I think is a wonderful book. You can buy the American first online. It's quite expensive, but I'd never seen the first UK edition. And the whole point of what I was going to read is that I've never seen it, but I will buy it when I find it. On the way to Mag's, we walked past Jarndyce Books, and there is the first UK edition in the window. Various things have happened like this, which have made me wish that I had mentioned in here that I'm also looking, not just for a Shakespeare First Folio, but maybe Arthur Machen's Fleet Street Diversions and Digressions, the great lost book by Machen. As we're back at Machen, perhaps I should end up with a reading which the great occult Burke. The House of the Hidden Light was regarded by occultists as a magical text, albeit one that defied satisfactory explanation. Such was its reputation that many investigators, including Crowley, sought its key, though none unlocked its secrets. There's a photocopy of it. There were only 3 copies printed back in the day. There's a photocopy in Newport Reference Library, and it's been annotated by Crowley. But it's a photocopy of a photocopy, and you can't read Crowley's handwriting, unfortunately. It was at Newport Reference Library that I photocopied it for myself. And when I discussed it with Bob Gilbert, Waite's biographer, he admitted that he knew exactly what the House of the Hidden Light was about. It's a coded record of Machen and Waite's nocturnal adventures around London, often in the company of women friends. It may not have been the great magical text that so many had hoped for, but Bob's research illuminated an important period in the lives of 2 influential literary and occult figures. Janet Machen, Arthur Machen's daughter, gave me permission to publish the book on behalf of Machen's estate, and Bob arranged for the rights from the Waite estate. He agreed, additionally, to write an introduction and provide notes. Bob himself owned one of the 3 extant copies, but it was at that time in the hands of George Locke, who had a shop just over the way. In fact, he was in the basement just over the way. And George had an option to buy this edition of this copy of The House of the Hidden Light. And I told Bob that we didn't need George's input because I had my own photocopy, but Bob suggested it was politic not to mention this to George because he was meant to be buying this edition. Now, to acquire Bob's work and the weight rights, it was made clear I would have to co-publish with George. And so, after a convivial lunchtime meeting in the Plough on Museum Street, it was agreed that I would produce the book in conjunction with George's Ferret Fantasy imprint. George did subsequently discover that I had a photocopy of the text, but it proved not to be a problem. I ended up transcribing the book myself, designing it, and overseeing production. I was pleased with the book that we published, what should have been the first trade edition of The House of the Hidden Light. However, a few days before publication, while our edition was still at the bindery, George announced the publication of his own very limited edition variant of the text. Not only had I been beaten to issuing the first edition, but Ferret Fantasy's version was a stapled booklet, badly photocopied on dark brown paper, that even George admitted in his catalogue was unreadable. It was also more expensive than our own printed and bound edition. And when I asked George why he had done this, he apologised, claiming that he had assumed that our edition had been published already. And he asked me to take pity on him, saying that his mailing list was minuscule, and pointing out that his own publications never sold more than 6 copies. He did take 60 copies of our edition, at cost price, because after all he was the co-publisher. He didn't make any effort to sell these until after we had sold out of ours, and then he offered his copies at twice the price, claiming the book was out of print. A few years later I discovered that he had not bought Bob's copy of The House of the Hidden Light after all. It's now in a museum in Amsterdam. I subsequently found out, because Bob Gilbert has read this, he said he had no idea that Bob had done his own edition, because he didn't see it. Oh, sorry, that George had done his own copy, own edition, which kind of sums up George. And Simon Patterson at Horaxia Books, advert for Simon, if you'd like a copy of The House of the Hidden Light, the Tartarus Press Ferret Fantasy edition, have a word with Simon, because he's taken over George's stock, and of the 60 copies that George had, there's about 56 left. They are available.
£5 each.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Hi there.
You've published so many wonderful books. Is there any book that you published that you wish you had?
Am I allowed to? No. They've all been, every author has been fine.
Would you like me to leave the room while you answer that question?
No, not really. No, thank you, Darcy. That's a really awkward question. I don't think so. Yes, no, there is one. We produced for many years a guide to the values of first edition books, and about the 4th or 5th edition we did several thousand, and it made us good money. It was subsidising Tartarus, and we did one edition too many. The internet came along. We ended up with a lot of copies, but it wasn't a proper Tartarus book. It was a terribly venal commercial undertaking. Any other questions?
Yeah, have you got a book that didn't make 50 and you said, I've got to have to leave that one out because I'm full up? Was there one that didn't quite make the cut?
There were quite a lot, actually. I was tempted to follow it up with 50 well-remembered books, because the point is that although forgotten books are great, and it's wonderful when you wander into a bookshop and you think, what on earth's that? And you take it off the shelf and you read the first page and you think, that's quite good. And you take it home and 6 months later you read it and you think, blimey, I've discovered a classic here. It doesn't happen very often. Most of the classics are classics for good reasons. and a lot of my favourite books really are well known, and I can't think of anything there wasn't a 51st book. There were another 50 books, but not just a 51st.
Not just one. There wasn't just one.
No.
That,
No, it was a completely arbitrary number,
yeah.
50, has to be said. I'm getting off lightly here. Oh, sorry.
What's the story about the blue paper copy of Hill of Dreams? I mean, why was that printed on blue paper? Was there a tradition of printing books?
No, it was. I think it must have been in that time, around about exactly 100 years ago. Machen was being collected, especially in America, in a big way. It was his. He wasn't making much money from the books, but he was making money from signing special editions left, right, and centre. And someone said, "Let's print the Hill of Dreams on blue paper." And I'm sure Machen would have said, "Why?" But if you're going to pay me, I'll sign it. And there were 200 copies. And it is actually relatively readable. It's not too bad. But I first came across a copy in Brian Banks's and bookshop, Deja Vu Books, and the Grimoire bookshop, which was Catherine, I've forgotten her surname, in Brighton, which it was just out of my reach financially. And then when I went back, I'm not sure I was going back to actually, in my mind I was going back to buy it, but I still think it was too much. And the bookshop had gone. Midnight Flit, no one knew what had happened to them. And then around about 3 or 4 years ago, we were in York, a group of us, and I was walking down the street and I saw a sign, Grimoire Books. And I thought, well, that's the same as Catherine Walton. Wandered in, there was Catherine. Hadn't changed, exactly the same stock as, 20, 25 years previously. Hello, Catherine, do you remember me? It's Ray Russell. Oh, yes, yeah. Absolutely fine, wonderful bookshop, lots of tribal masks and things upstairs, just as it was. And the very first launch for 50 Forgotten Books was at Lucius Bookshop in York, and I decided I'd tell the story of Catherine, the blue paper copy, and she hadn't replied to my email, so on the day of the launch I went down to see her, to see if she was coming along. Bookshop was empty, nothing there. And the little Apple bookshop 2 doors along, I went in and said, well, what's happened to Catherine? And she said, nobody knows. She said, I locked up the other evening and said goodbye to Catherine. The next morning, the shop was empty, and she must have had thousands of books in there, all gone overnight. And she said, I've no idea how she did it. Now, Catherine is famous in Drift's Guide because Drift was annoyed that when he didn't pay for something, she threatened him with legal action. And he said, well, she's a magician. She sells magical books. Why didn't she put a spell or a curse on me? I know how she emptied her bookshop overnight. It was magic. Obviously, I don't believe in magic, but Catherine was obviously had magical abilities. So yeah, the blue paper Hill of Dreams is something I've always wanted, and it is a nice book to read, even though it's blue. It's very odd.
Like Tartarus editions are like, what, 250, 300 copies?
Yeah, 300 on average.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know about Michael Hurley's The Lonely, is that right? Yeah, but is there anything that you've published in a limited edition that's like that's actually inspired somebody to republish it, like to mass market? That's
Well,
maybe sold more than...
No, I mean, the Lonely was a real one-off, and I'm sure, I mean, Ros received it in the, it's not the slush pile, it was a submission, and loved it, and went back to Andrew and said, we're interested in publishing it, can we talk about it? And Andrew was, well, it'd been about 2 years before he came back to us, and he'd done more work on it, and we thought it was, even better. And he did extremely well, obviously, and it won the Costa First Novel Award and various things. And it won the Book Business Award or something. It was something probably technical like that. But it's a wonderful book. But I think the only other person I would say that we've really kind of helped would be Arthur Machen, in that over the years we've been publishing Machen and slowly sort of pushing on that door, and then the Library of Wales came along with their editions, The Hill of Dreams, and there's another one, wasn't there? And there's now various sort of classic versions.
And Aikman. Yes.
Oh, I suppose Aikman, yeah. Aikman was out of fashion. I mean, one of the reasons he was out of fashion was that there was apparently, we were told at the time, I haven't followed this story up, there was a kind of dispute over his estate. So various people had tried publishing Aikman and were told, no, we haven't quite worked out the legal ramifications. And we just happened to ask at the right time, which was pure serendipity. And yeah, then people like the League of Gentlemen and Jeremy Dyson bought our copies, and other people, and yeah, he's Faber very slowly and reluctantly have put him into print in paperback. First with Faber Fines, and then with proper paperbacks. But nothing quite like The Lonely. I think that's a one-off. That
I
won't
think it's
happen
once in
again.
a lifetime.
Yeah,
The Lonely.
yeah.
You don't anticipate like Frederick Rolfe or anyone like that having a bit of a revival?
Personally, I can't see Rolfe having a revival. I think he's a bit too esoteric and hard work. I'm sure Mark would disagree, being a big Rolfe fan.
Well, Hadrian the Seventh has been in paperback quite often.
Hadrian Seventh can't have gone out of print,
Yeah.
but I don't know how many copies it sells. Anyone else?
No, sorry, I was going to get something. No, you
Yeah.
did have a question.
Well, thank you all very much for coming along. And yep, signed copies of various books are available.
Thank you.